Well, you've had a very illustrious scientific career, which is really still ongoing. But I'm interested in knowing how you got started in science. I mean, what were you first interested in? Did you start, for example, wanting to play the violin and then
No.
switching to science?
No, when I was a child, I wanted to be an archaeologist. But when I got to grade 8, I got a science teacher who was doing a master's degree in biology, and he made it sound pretty fascinating to me. And then when I got to grade 10, I got another biology teacher who had taken a master's degree in biology, and he used to take us on field trips across the Northwest Arm in Halifax to the other side of this long, narrow strip of water, and would take us on field trips in the woods and so on, and turn over stones and tell us what was under. He'd show us little salamanders, or he'd talk about flowers. And I thought this was just great, this wandering around and understanding what the landscape was like, what the plants and animals were, and so on. So I decided to be a biologist about then.
About the 8th grade time, something like that.
Yeah, well, it was the 8th grade that started. It was the 10th grade that sort of confirmed me in the idea that that's what I wanted to major in at college.
And so this, you mentioned that this was a master's degree, high school teacher?
Yeah.
And this was unusual then, to have a master's degree?
Well, yes, it was, I think. It was quite unusual.
And so that was then, well, what year are we talking about then?
This would be the mid-40s, mid-1940s.
Oh, I see, mid-40s, yeah.
Or actually be earlier than that, because I started college in 1942, so it'd be a couple of years before that.
Oh, you're right, yeah, definitely pre-nuclear era.
Oh, yeah,
yeah.
It was just about the start of World War II.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so you talk a bit about chance and serendipity in science, and how that has affected your career. Is this an example of that, or
Well, it's an example that I was just lucky enough to have the right sort of teachers to enthuse me about it. And when I got into college, I got an elementary biology teacher who was full of enthusiasm, who gave me lots of enthusiasm for biology. Then I had 3 other professors. It was a small college of 600 students, and there were 4 professors of biology. The first one was a botanist who made me enthusiastic about botany, even though he was doing plant anatomy, which is dull, at least in my estimation. But then I took a course in genetics and another in embryology, that taught by a woman who was interested in presenting the subject with a historical perspective. She would go back to the earliest work and bring it forward in time.
You mean historical perspective from how the field developed?
Yeah. And I found it fascinating. I think a lot of the students just hated this approach, but because I've tried it myself with not very good results.
Well, you've taught it the historical approach.
But it captivated me, and I've done a lot of work in the history of ecology and biogeochemistry. Then another prof was a plant ecologist who took me on summer field trips with him with grant money. And so I learned the joys of field biology, and he was full of questions about, why should this plant grow here, or why do we have beech forest here or birch forest there. And I began to see there were lots of questions out there in nature that you could wander around and think about. And then finally I had a zoology professor who was an expert on salmon biology, who taught me the scientific rigor, because every time I made any statement that was at all criticizable, he would be there to tell me where I was wrong. And so I learned something different from each of these people.
The salmon biology, that was, that you had done some work then on salmon?
Well, I did my master's degree on salmon embryology. Mm-hmm. That was the first real research I'd undertaken. But it turned out to be, again, one of these chance events. I was studying the project I was given was to study the development of the Golgi apparatus, which is a little cellular organelle, secretory organelle in cells, in salmon embryos under a range of temperatures to see whether temperature affected Golgi body formation. And so I set up these little salmon there, from the eggs, and grew them into little embryos about so long, and studied sampled them for cells that I wanted to treat and so on. But at the end of it, it was a total failure because the technique that I'd been taught to use for staining these Golgi bodies didn't seem to work with the salmon embryos. So I was dead in the water.
This was a master's.
Yeah, and my scientific career could have ended there. I could have gone, you know, if that had failed, I could have gone into school teaching or something like that.
So there may have been an effect, but the particular method you were using did not detect it.
That's right, yeah, total failure. And I was just lucky because I happened to notice that I'd been using a series of stages of salmon development to mark where I was at in the process of development, and these had been devised by one of my professors.
You mean these were stages you could observe under the microscope?
Yeah, when bile appears in the gut, when the fins start moving, when the heart starts beating, things like that. These were transparent embryos, you could see through them. And so I had all these stages, and I happened to notice that changing the temperature dislocated the stages, even within the normal range of temperature that the salmon lived at, and we were studying it out to the edges of temperature where the eggs just wouldn't develop at all. So, as it turned out, I wrote my thesis on the effect of temperature in dislocating development of salmon embryos, which of course had a practical consequence I wasn't even thinking of, because I'm sure it's a very important subject in thermal pollution.
Right. So, all right. So you looked at, and you found that the development of the salmon embryos then varied with temperature, even within the range that they normally encountered.
Yeah.
And especially when you went beyond that range.
Yeah, because beyond the range, a little beyond the range, you began to see monsters, fish with curved backs, two-headed fish, things like that. Wow. If you got farther out, they just didn't develop.
Well, and then that's relevant to pollution from temperature.
Yeah, that's right.
From plants dumping warm water into streams and things.
So you have big effects like just eggs not developing, but you have these tiny effects that are hard to observe of dislocating development, and who knows what that signifies.
Yeah. So this connection between pure science and practical application started really very early in your career then.
Yeah, but I didn't view it in that way at all. I didn't even think of it as practical applications at all, because in my day in Canada and in Britain, applied science was sort of second-rate science. No, everybody wanted to do basic science. If you were any good at all, that's what you did.
You wouldn't do applied science.
No.
Yeah. Which is really a change from today. I think today
that's right.
It's quite respected to do applied science.
Yeah, in fact, it's often expected that you have some practical application. But in those days, it was a no-no.
So the chance event here was that for just purposes of keeping your notes, you were keeping track of the phases, and you were after the Golgi body study.
Yeah.
That was an utter failure, but then you noticed the phases had something. So that was like a chance event.
Yeah, and I was lucky enough to see it.
You were, or smart enough to see it. Right, so that these chance events then, they probably happen all the time.
Yeah.
Probably to everybody.
They do,
And a few people like you, I think, maybe take advantage of them and notice them.
Yeah, my career has entirely been governed by chance. I see science as being done in two ways. There's rule-based science, in which you have an idea, you develop a hypothesis, you test it. If it works out, you go on to the next idea. If it doesn't work out, you try another hypothesis and test that. But my kind of science is based on chance and serendipity, on what Dickens's Mr. Micawber would have said, something will turn up. And so my view is I go around and I think this might be interesting. Let's get some data and see what they tell us, which is a totally different approach, which means that I've done all sorts of different things rather than following a linear process in one topic.
And it isn't what we teach in science very much.
No, not at all.
And maybe because that's very dangerous to teach that.
Well,
because maybe it is.
Well, to feel you have to rely on chance and serendipity is a little frustrating, but it's worked for me. But I think teaching the rule-based science also has a bad effect, because it gets students the idea that science is really dull. It's just a linear progression that's rather mechanical, and whereas my kind of science is inspirational. You get an inspiration, follow it up.
So what I see your career, when I look at it from a distance anyways, you have this pure science central portion, understanding, for example, the structure of ecosystems, peatlands. And then on the way, you've discovered little things, and you take a side branch, and then that has to take some huge change in the world. Then you move on, and then discover a little side branch, another huge change in the world, and then and so on. And that how you see it, or am I just?
Yeah, no, that's right. I just find things are interesting and decide to that here's a fascinating puzzle. Let's get some data and see what it all means.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky enough to be able to do that because I've never been constrained by a mission. And I think so many scientists now are bound by their missions.
What does it mean, a mission, then?
That you're to understand, say, how fertilizer affects wheat, or how changing a policy affects the fishing in Lake Mille Lacs.
So you have very targeted research.
Very targeted research.
And that's done in order that research can be practical and applied.
That's right.
But it looks like in your case, and this may be generally true, when you focus the research then, you don't see well, what I mean is, nobody has done more practical things for the world and environment than you, I think. And this was all based on not focusing on doing something for the world.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
So when you focus on something, you may somehow lose focus.
Well, when you focus on something, you don't follow the side trails.
Yeah.
The ideas you might have, that's not part of my mission. I can't follow that up. But I've been lucky in being able to follow up whatever I wanted to do. I was studying limnology in the study of lakes in the Freshwater Biological Association in the English Lake District. And you'd think that I would be focusing on lakes. And it led in quite a different direction. It led me to study acid rain and radioactive fallout and pulmonary disease in human beings. Now, the director of the station could very well have said, look, Eville, this is really not part of our mission here. You shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. Focus on something to do with the lakes. But he never said a word. I was just allowed to do as I damn well pleased.
So that's a very interesting lesson about pure science leading to practical application.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's really been that way, I think, through the history of science.
Without basic science, there'd be no applied science.
And so what's happened is, I think all about us, all the time, there are these random events.
Yeah.
And when we focus on a mission, we ignore those, or we push them out of the way.
Yeah.
And what it seems like you do is you keep your eye out for those.
That's right.
And when you see something...
Because I don't have a mission.
You don't have a mission, yet you have some of the most strongly useful science that anyone has done. That's very interesting.
Just absolutely by accident.
Well, by accident, but by taking advantage of the accident, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think it's quite
but
by accident.
I never set out to save the environment.
Yeah. Well, so I remember you telling, when I took the ecosystems class from you, ecosystem ecology, told about some story. I sort of dug this out of you, I think, but I don't remember it quite. It was a connection between bloodhounds and milkshakes and radioactivity, and that was something you put as a chance event, which I think was your taking advantage of chance events. But what is that?
Well, in the 1950s, when I was in the Lake District, the local medical officer of health was concerned about possibility of an accident at the plutonium factory at Windscale on the outer western edge of the Lake District. And
was that a nuclear power, or was that a manufacturing?
They were manufacturing plutonium for
weapons.
bombs.
Oh yeah.
And I knew it was there, but I didn't know anything about it. But I wound up studying radioactive fallout, possibly from that plant, because I drank milkshakes I really liked the milkshakes at a particular drugstore in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And if that hadn't been true, I never would have done the research at all.
That you liked milkshakes at this particular drugstore.
Yeah.
And so how did that lead to the radio?
Well, the owner or manager of that drugstore had a bloodhound. And I fell in love with that dog, and I vowed that someday when I was in the country where I could have a big dog, I would have a bloodhound. Well, when we moved to the Lake District, great country for bloodhounds. Mountains to walk across, and fields to walk across, woods and valleys and pastures and things. So I set about acquiring a bloodhound. The only person who had one in the Lake District was Frank Madge, who was the medical officer of health for Westmoreland, this person who'd been concerned about wind scale. So I went to see him, and he pointed me in the direction of where I could acquire a bloodhound, and we became friends. And, you know, we used to use our bloodhounds together to trail kids and things like that.
Oh, to actually track?
Yeah.
You mean like lost kids, or just for fun?
Just for fun.
For fun, okay, yeah.
So we became firm friends. And then, of course, Frank, who'd been told by the Atomic Energy Authority that they didn't need any liaison with the medical officer because there wasn't going to be any accident. Every possible backup had been built into this plant, so we needn't worry about a liaison. Then, of course, in 1957, the pile caught fire and dumped 20,000 curies of radioiodine and several hundred curies of strontium-90 and cesium-137 on us. It took us 10 years to find out how much that was. They never did tell us whether they dumped any plutonium on us at all, but I'm sure they did. And so Frank was very upset about this. And the authorities kept telling him, well, there's no problem. When the accident first happened, they said, oh, it's not a problem, it's all blown out to sea, against the direction of the prevailing winds. Then 4 days later, they closed down milk deliveries over 200 square miles. Just at the time my wife Ada was weaning our first daughter, Carson, from the breast to cow's milk. And of course, there were all sorts of rumors flying about. Did you know that farmer so-and-so had his cows trucked away last night to be examined? And so Frank was very upset. And because we were such firm friends, and he knew I worked in a lab where they had Geiger counters, he said, can't you check up on these guys? Can't you test some of my water samples? Because his villages were being fed by waters from these high, small lakes called tarns in the mountains. And that's where the rain was falling, 100 inches a year. And so he was concerned about this. And I didn't want to do it because I knew nothing about radioactivity. I'd never operated a Geiger counter. So I put him off. But eventually, Don Swift, my colleague who had one, stopped using it to write up some research. And finally, I gave in to Frank and said, well, I'll try. So I got Don Swift to teach me how to do this.
To run a Geiger counter.
How to run a Geiger counter. And I would go out and collect a liter or so of water and evaporate it down in a dish to dryness.
From lakes? Or
from local lakes and these tarns that Frank was concerned about.
Like reservoirs.
Yeah. And they were natural bodies of water,
yeah.
but that's where they got their water supply.
Yeah.
And so I would evaporate this water to dryness, ash it in a muffle furnace to get rid of any organic matter, then scrape up the residue, stick it in the planchette, and stick it in the Geiger counter and count it. And I was getting nowhere with this. The counter would go.
Very low radioactivity.
And so I was getting just a trace above background.
So there was no radioactivity in the water?
In the water, yeah.
So,
So I kept telling Frank, well, another negative result. But because of the rumors of local hotspots, he kept saying, well, so-and-so says this might have been where a lot of the fallout came down. Would you try this one? And I was lying in bed one night trying to think how I could tell Frank, gee, I'm not going to do this anymore. We're getting nowhere with it. All of a sudden, it occurred to me, I was using ion exchange resins that absorb cations.
These are would be in a water.
Things like calcium and strontium.
And this is the kind of idea like in a water softener where it absorbs salt, absorbs hardness, but you looking to absorb radioactive things.
Well, at the time I thought I was using it to measure sulfate and chloride in water samples. But it suddenly occurred to me that if I poured gallons of water through one of these ion exchange resins, it would pick up all the strontium and cesium-137. It's an organic resin. I could ash that, count the ash, and see what was going on. And then it was just as though an electric light flashed in my brain. I suddenly thought, my God, the hillsides are covered with ion exchangers. They're called sphagnum moss. And so I went on a morning walk with my bloodhound and collected some sphagnum. And of course, I went through the usual procedure. I ashed it, put it in the planchette, and instead of the count rate going suddenly it started going, and I thought, my God, something's gone wrong here. So I rushed down to Don Swift's lab and said, Don, come quick, something's gone wrong with your counter. And he came up and he was very upset. he said, well, I won't say what he said. Said, you've contaminated the counter with radioiodine from my fume hood. And I swore I'd never been near his fume hood. And he said, well, this is an impossible result. It can't be real.
You were a pretty young scientist at this point.
Oh, yeah. And so he said, go get another sample, which I did. Counted exactly the same. Then I thought I would compare it with other plants just to see if other plants were similarly radioactive. So I started sampling all sorts of vegetation, you know, woodland plants, grassland plants, plants from gardens. They all counted far more slowly than sphagnum. And so it seemed
they weren't radioactive. Right?
They had radioactivity, long-lived radioisotopes like potassium-40, which wouldn't change over the decades since they'd been collected. So, and I found they were counting very low. So obviously this was radioactive fallout. Now, was it from wind scale? Well, what I did was I showed the bunch of the lab boys, young men actually, who helped us out on collections and things. I sent them around the Lake District to get us, I showed them some sphagnum, said, go collect a plant like this and go to different places, but get as close to the wind scale wire as you can. I didn't want to go there with an American-Canadian accent, prowling around the wind scale perimeter. So I said, you go. You speak the local dialect. If they ask you, you're checking for next week's fox hunt. And so they brought back all sorts of samples. It was, they all counted the same. They didn't, no count rate increase as I approached wind scale. Then I went off to the Pennine Mountains in England and collected some from far away. They were just the same. They were counting just the same. So obviously
it was
all
counting high radioactivity even far away.
Yeah. So it wasn't wind scale.
Oh yeah, I see. It wasn't wind scale. This showed it wasn't wind scale. Everything was the same.
Yeah. So it had to be radioactive fallout if it was anything. Now, was it radioactive fallout? There are two ways you can approach this. You can take some plants that were collected and put in herbaria years before they started developing nuclear weapons and see what their radioactivity was like. And it was very low. The other way you can do it is to follow the same plant sample for several months and see if the radioactivity decays away. And over several months, a lot of it decayed away. Now that meant it had to be fallout.
So first of all, old plants from the museums didn't have this radioactivity.
No.
So that was pre-nuclear era.
They were much lower.
And then when you held them there, the radioactivity vanished. It means it was being replenished from rain or something.
Yeah. Well, it meant that you had radioactive isotopes that would not last very long. Yeah. They wouldn't be present in these old herbarium samples.
Oh.
So essentially, if you have a rapid decay rate, if say it goes down to a third or a quarter in 3 months.
I see. That showed it had to be new radioactivity.
It had to be new radioactivity.
Had to be
so
new
it had to be fallout.
Had to be fallout. It was so it was the same no matter where you're near the plutonium plant or not.
Yeah.
And it was new radio. So that proved it was fallout.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it proved it was being collected in the plants of the world, the sphagnum moss.
Yeah. That sphagnum was doing it very well. I thought, well, what does all this mean? And I thought, well, it's interesting. I'll write a little paper about it. But then
you found this in sphagnum and other things as well, like lichens and other.
Well, that came later. I wrote a little paper for Nature.
A little paper for Nature.
Yeah, and I submitted it to my director as we always did, but he never did anything about it. He said, he sent it to the person at the Atomic Energy Authority who was looking at fallout in nature.
He sent your manuscript.
He sent the manuscript without my knowledge.
Oh, and did you have it targeted at nature at that point, or?
Yeah, I did.
You did, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And this guy raised various objections, which I met. You know, I found ways to counter his arguments.
He was like a reviewer.
He was like a reviewer, and he didn't really want this published.
Oh.
So my director sent him back a revised version to take account of with my answers to his criticisms. He still didn't want to see it published, but I said, well, what the hell? Let's let the editors decide.
Editors of Nature.
The editors of Nature. So I sent it off. My director had no objection to that.
Was he objecting that this was incorrect, or that it wasn't science, or that it was?
I don't know. I just didn't. I think he thought it was bad news, and he didn't want it publicized. That's my guess. Anyway, I sent it off
To Nature.
to Nature, and it was the lead letter of that volume.
They made it their lead article.
They made it the lead article.
This is still a fairly young scientist at that point.
Oh, I was what, 1958 to 33,
Oh, wow.
and so it was published, and it was mentioned in the Observer, one of the better British newspapers. It was mentioned under one of the sort of mass circulation papers. Bluebells show H-bomb risk.
Bluebells.
Bluebells. Why they picked bluebells, I have no idea.
That was one of your plants.
No.
But they were glamorous and swaggy.
They were glamorous, yeah. I mean, everybody in Britain knows bluebells.
Uh-huh. Right.
So,
but the point was plants are showing radioactivity.
Plants are picking up radioactivity, and this is a risky business. Mm-hmm. So then I started.
This was around the late 50s then.
Yeah.
And there was a huge international uproar that came
after 1957.
Yeah.
And so I kept on collecting plants, and I, again by chance, decided I should pick up some lichens. Mm-hmm. And they also counted like mad, of course, because they depend on the rain and the dust for their nutrients. They don't have roots.
Even more than sphagnum lack roots, I think. But like sphagnum lack roots, so they have to get everything from the rain.
Yeah.
And so then they also act as ion exchange filters and filter out the radioactivity and capture it in their tissues.
And then another chance event happened. At that time, I used to, I wasn't teaching, I was just doing research, and sometimes I'd come to the end of something, and for want of anything better to do, I'd go and browse in the library to see what had come in recently. And I found a little 3 or 4 page brochure from the Norwegian Defense Research Ministry. We only got about 4 or 5 of them. Why they came to us, God only knows. And in this was a paragraph saying that in Sweden, they'd noticed that reindeer were picking up a lot more strontium-90 than sheep. Of course,
reindeer were getting more radioactivity than
sheep.
Sheep were.
And of course, it clicked in my mind immediately. Sheep eat grass. Reindeers eat reindeer lichens.
Sure, yeah. Reindeer are caribou. They eat caribou moss.
Yeah.
Right, so they pick up the radioactivity and concentrate it.
And so I was predicting that to my friends. I didn't publish anything about this. This was really a side issue for me. After my paper in Nature, I did publish another paper in which the lichens did figure as equally able to take up these things. And I also mentioned this Norwegian paper as showing that the reindeer ate the moss, ate the lichens, and were more radioactive than sheep. And of course, the natural prediction is that if people eat reindeer, they're going to concentrate it at one more step.
Even further concentrate.
Now, I didn't mention that because I had no evidence. But 4 years, a few months later, I think it was, there was a paper in Science showing that Alaskan Eskimos, or Inuit as they're now called, were showing up much more strontium-90 than the population of Seattle. So the Eskimos were picking up fallout.
I think that's when the huge international uproar came.
That's when people began to suspect. A few years later, they began to see huge levels of cesium-137, another fallout isotope, in Lapland reindeer herders. And so it became clear that there was a method. These people were particularly at risk from radioactive fallout through their food chain.
Yeah.
And I read about this in the newspaper because at the time, the Atomic Energy Commission here was planning to blow a harbor in the northwest coast of Alaska to build a harbor.
With nuclear...
Well, we learned later that what they really wanted was a harbor for nuclear submarines, but we didn't know that at the time. It was just to blow a harbor up there for them. And the local people were upset about this. It was close to caribou grazing grounds and so on. And the AEC did a lot of background research on the plants and so on, animals. But they didn't publish it. But the St. Louis Committee for Nuclear Information, which was then doing a baby tooth survey for strontium-90 all over the country, people were sending in baby teeth to be counted.
I see.
Decided they would review the information the Atomic Energy Commission had gathered, and unfortunately, I don't think they'd ever done any lichens or things like that. But anyway, the St. Louis Committee for Nuclear Information mentioned that they thought this was a risky business, that the caribou would eat lichens, which picked up fallout like crazy, and the Eskimo would eat the caribou, and they would concentrate it at a further step, and they would be at risk. So this was mentioned in the newspaper, and the fellow who ran the St. Louis Committee for Nuclear Information was Barry Colliner. And so I wrote to Barry and I said I'd be interested to get some of the background data for this, because a few years ago, this was in 1961 that these findings about cesium came out. But it was before, no, I'm sorry, it was before any of this information came out about concentration in people. They reviewed the AEC data, concluded that this food chain contamination could take place and that the Eskimo were at risk. And so I saw this in the newspaper, wrote to Barry, and said, you know, I really am interested. I did a little work on this a few years ago, so I'd like to know what the current status is with data and so on. So could you send me something of what you've done? And he sent back a copy of their newsletter, in which it pointed out that the basis for their claim that lichens picked up excessive amounts of fallout was my paper. And they hadn't done any new research at all. But this was the basis for their suggestion of this food chain contamination.
So what made this such a huge international issue, I think, in the 50s, early 60s, was not just that this was an effect on humans, but this was, at that time the world was a huge place, and we really thought there was no way humans could have effect on the whole globe, I think. And here was an example of something affecting
worldwide.
People at the ends of the earth.
Yeah, and people who had nothing to do with setting up the problem. So the Eskimos protested, and they, together with other environmental groups, managed to get the Project Chariot stopped. They didn't use this nuclear explosive.
This is the one for building the bay.
Yeah, that's right. So that was stopped, and that, of course, gave a huge impetus to the fight to stop nuclear testing in the atmosphere. The fact that northern peoples, who have nothing to do with creating the problem, were likely to be the ones to suffer most from it.
Yeah, people at the ends of the earth were suffering from this. And so then it was not, well, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was something like 1963, I think.
Oh,
1963.
I can't remember. But
I think it's something like that. And so it was really only a very few years from the time of your paper in Nature to the time of the 100 nations signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty.
Yeah.
So actually, how did this make a young scientist feel?
Well, it was actually my second paper in the Canadian Journal of Botany that dealt with lichens, and that mentioned this reindeer concentration from the Norwegian data that got the whole thing going. And
still, how did this make you feel when you did something, got it published, and then when 100 nations signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, did you feel that was partly your?
No.
It seems to me it was partly your work that caused that. Because the international uproar was enormous.
Oh yeah. No, I didn't think a thing about it. I wasn't an applied
So
scientist.
what do you think today?
I'm glad I had a small part to play in.
A small part.
To play in
It seems to me that's a wonderful way to start a career.
But as I say, it never would have happened had I not drunk milkshakes at that drugstore in
Yeah.
Quimpool Road in Halifax.
Yeah, and then followed all these pathways.
Yeah.
Right. And this really was, so this was a side pathway.
This was a sideshow for me. I went back to studying lakes and
Yeah.
and
But you took this, and it was a little bit of effort to go that pathway and then
Oh, yeah.
come back.
And I never even bothered to ask the director if I could do it. I just went ahead and did it.
Yeah.
And
But it seems
he didn't raise a murmur.
it seems to me that the nuclear test ban treaty was worth that little effort.
Yes, I think so.
So
But at the time, I was really studying the chemistry of rainwater and bog pools. And again, that was not part of my mission, and it was entirely accidental, because I had spent a postdoctoral year in Sweden and gone out on a peat bog with Einar Durie, who was the doyen of Swedish plant ecology at the time, and his graduate student, Margareta Witting, who at that, I didn't know at the time, she was his mistress. She later became his wife. But anyway, Margareta was studying the chemistry of bog pools, the chemistry of bog waters. Mm-hmm. And she told me that essentially they were modified rainwater. They were getting their calcium and magnesium, potassium, and so on.
So bogs,
Sulfur.
yeah. So bogs are places where nutrients don't flow in from the outside, but arrive from the rain.
The bogs are domed up,
Yeah.
so that stuff runs off the surface round the bog. It doesn't get any influence from the mineral soil surrounding it.
Entirely dependent on rainwater for their
and
nutrients.
Sounded entirely logical to me, and I thought, well, of course she's right, but she's never studied the rain. She's never done any rain chemistry.
So if you're going to understand peatland and bog water, you better understand rain.
You should understand rain.
Yeah.
Well, this was when I was still at University College London, and before I moved to the Lake District in 1954. And so I'd done some freshwater work in Canada, in Nova Scotia, and I wanted to work on freshwater biology. So I asked Professor Pearsall, again, whom I came across quite by accident, if I could do a PhD in freshwater biology. He said, there's no place in the country where you can do a PhD in freshwater biology. So he sent me to the Freshwater Biological Association, the world center for freshwater biology and limnology at the time, to work on mineral uptake by plants in woodlands. Why he did that, I had no idea, because I could easily have done a PhD in freshwater studies there. But I've never understood it. Anyway, I got this opportunity, again by accident, to move to the Lake District as a research scientist. And it was there that I studied the fallout. And it was there that I studied acid rain.
It seemed like, and you started working on acid rain as a way to understand how peatlands and bogs.
I just wanted to check up on Margareta. I believed her, but I thought,
hypothesized this or claimed this, and
but she'd never measured the chemistry of the rain. So I thought, well, I'll just go and get some bog water. I was now in a country rural district, presumably an unpolluted area. And I'd go and get some bog waters, and I'd get some rainwater samples and compare them. And of course, it turned out that Margareta was perfectly right, as I expected. But
you mean that the acidity of bogs was matching the acidity of the rain, or? Yeah,
the bog pools were essentially similar to rainwater,
replicating the rainwater,
except they had a lot of dissolved organic matter in them. But then it happened again by pure coincidence that my colleagues John Macrith and Jack Heron were doing a chemical survey of the lakes and tarns in the Lake District from the central mountains on hard rocks, difficult to weather, to the periphery, to the agricultural soils. And their survey showed that out on the outskirts the lakes were highly calcareous. You got to the central mountains, they were extremely dilute. They were essentially, these little tarns were in Rocky Mountains. They were getting essentially rainwater.
So as you got away from the Rocky, you got into things that were picking up calcium and things from the minerals
soil.
From the soil.
Yeah. And these were softer rocks, more easily weathered.
Weathered rock. And then up in the mountains with the hard rocks than they were just replicating the
Yeah,
rainwater.
mostly the rain just ran over
Yeah.
the rocks and into the tarns.
Mm-hmm.
And they found, to their surprise, that these tarns were strongly acid.
Mm-hmm.
Big surprise.
The ones that were replicating rainwater were strongly acid.
Yeah, the ones in the Central Mountains.
Yeah.
And of course, I had the answer. It's acid rain, because I'd been finding that the rain that fell was not, that this was really not an unpolluted rural area. That when the wind blew from the industrial areas of Lancashire or Northumberland and Durham, we were being drenched by dilute sulfuric acid.
And
When
so
the wind blew from the sea, we were drenched by sodium chloride, sea salt.
So your work to check up on the rain and the peatlands, you just saw it's winds from some direction led to acid, other
Yeah.
directions led to sea salt, etc.
You know, so it was quite
So you-
clearly a question of air pollution, that this was not an unpolluted rural district. And that we'd known about acid rain since 1852 when Angus Smith discovered it in the city of Leeds. He was the inspector
There was
of
really no talk about acid rain.
No. But he discovered that the rain was acid in Leeds and other British cities.
And then what became of that information?
It was essentially lost. He wrote about it. He wrote a book on air and rain in which he talked about it. It was essentially forgotten.
Uh-huh.
But I found out later that the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research was still sampling rain in cities, and it was still pretty acid.
Mm-hmm.
What my discovery was that the air pollution generated by these cities was not falling out all locally, that it was drifting across the countryside and polluting rural areas,
Yeah,
and
and
that the
some-
acid developed from the sulfur dioxide of the air pollution that was being emitted, changed to sulfuric acid, and acidified the lakes.
Right. So in the purest lakes is where
Yeah, that's-
distant lakes is where this effect is. This is another example then early on of how local effects were having broader implications.
That's right. That there was probably no place in Britain that was unpolluted.
Mm-hmm.
So
So the acid rain. So the acidity from the industrial plants was causing acid rain, and then that was destroying or affecting the lakes, and then eventually the forests.
yeah, but at that time I didn't go that far. I just was able to explain why John Mack's
Found his acidity.
lakes were strongly acid in these places.
So that was really the beginning of the modern acid rain story.
Yeah, that was when the acidification of lakes by acid rain from distant air pollution was established for the first time.
And this was concurrent with the radioactivity work or
Yeah,
subsequent
yeah.
to it?
No, it was
After-
concurrent.
Concurrent with it. Uh-huh.
And so I thought, it must have some effect on the biology of the organisms in the lake, but how can I find out about it? And there was no way, because we didn't know anything about the organisms. We had no background data to compare with what had been like in the past. So I was at a standstill. And then I suddenly thought, but it could be possible to see if there's an effect on humans. And so I knew that the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research was collecting data on rain chemistry in urban areas all over Britain.
Mm-hmm.
I knew that the Registrar General compiled mortality deaths.
Oh.
And so I thought, well, what about deaths from lung disease?
Hmm.
Could this be from inhaling air pollution, acids, whatever? And so I gathered a lot of data from the DSIR and the Registrar General. And what I found was that 3 different lung diseases correlated with 3 different components of acid rain. That bronchitis was connected to the acidity of the rain, which in the cities was largely due to hydrochloric acid, because there was a lot of hydrochloric acid being emitted, but it does fall out very close to where it
Hydrochloric
is
acid
emitted.
doesn't travel very far.
doesn't travel very far. And it was the predominant acid in the cities.
Mm-hmm.
The pneumonia death rate correlated with sulfate in the rain, which reflects the sulfur dioxide that you can breathe into your lungs.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time I thought it was just the sulfur dioxide. It turns out it's the sulfate particles that are generated in the atmospheric reactions of the sulfur dioxide that are the particulates that cause this disease. And I found, of course, as one might think, that the rate of death from lung cancer correlated with the tar deposit.
Tar deposit from the industrial plant.
Yeah.
As one would now understand.
Yeah.
But at the time, this was way before the cigarette tar issue had arisen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And so I published a couple of papers in The Lancet, a British medical journal. I think I might be the only ecologist ever to have published in The Lancet.
Oh, I see. So you're a biogeochemist now, and then you've got medical journal publications.
I couldn't get the paper on tar into The Lancet because the research on lung cancer from air pollution was more well advanced, and I was doing rather crude research.
Oh.
But the editors or the reviewers wouldn't accept it. So I published it in The Medical Officer, which was Frank Madge's journal of choice.
It's a medical journal, but not The Lancet.
Yeah. So that's how it all got started. Thereafter I spent 40 years working on acid rain.
40 years?
40 years. But again, all by accident. Had I not met Margareta Witting out on that bog, never would have done the research.
Yeah, well, you say all by accident, but there were these chance events that then you picked up on.
Yeah. I was lucky.
You were lucky, but somehow you were very perceptive.
Well, I was just interested in all sorts of things.
But now this acid rain led way beyond this, I think, because you eventually were invited by the White House to...
Well, 4 of us were invited by the President's Council on Environmental Quality to write a report on acid rain and its effects. This was much later, I can't remember just when, during Jimmy Carter's administration. And this report became the basis for his second report on the environment to the Congress, which led eventually to legislation to curb air pollution by sulfur dioxide. So it did tie into legislation and cleanup.
Right. So I remember at your retirement party, Gene Likens showed a graph. And this graph was sulfuric acid content of the rain in many parts of the country. And he showed here time on this axis, and on this axis he showed sulfuric acid concentration. And it started in the 19th century, and sulfuric acid concentration was going up and up and up and up and up till about 1970s or 80s. And then an abrupt change, and it fell back down so that in many places was down to 19th century levels again. And he said this changing point was Eville Gorham.
Well, Gene was being generous.
But this is one of the great environmental successes of all time, really, the reversal of acid rain, because we have many other problems left.
That's right.
But this reversal of acid rain from environmental problem across the globe to now, in many places, down to 19th century levels is one of the great environmental successes.
Along with the ban on fluorocarbons in the atmosphere.
Well, yes, right, so the ozone hole.
The ozone hole.
But the radioactive fallout is an example of where really society turned on a dime when we saw that there was a problem and a solution. Of course, there was an easy solution: stop testing in the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's right.
Acid rain, much more difficult solution. We have to rebuild all the industrial plants, but somehow we did that over the course of 30 years.
Retrofit them with cleanup devices and so on.
And these are really interesting examples of pure science leading to practical applications.
Yeah, and really, I just had no interest in practical science at all. It was just that I was drifted into these particular problems that seemed to me like fascinating puzzles, and I published on them in the regular scientific journals. Never occurred to me that I should go out and try to do something about any.
But eventually you did start coming to that realization.
Well, I came to that realization after I came to Minnesota. And it happened in 1962 when Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring was published. And again, it was by accident that I became an environmentalist, because Doug Pratt, who was my colleague in botany, had been invited to go to the park board and talk about Dutch elm disease and to say that using DDT to deal with Dutch elm disease was the wrong thing to do.
DDT for Dutch elm disease?
Yeah, they were
DDT to kill the beetles that spread the Dutch elm disease.
So, unfortunately, Doug fell ill, But he knew that I'd taken a seminar with Don Lawrence on Rachel Carson's book. We'd read a chapter a week and somebody would summarize it and we'd discuss it. So he knew that I had been part of this seminar. So he asked if I would go to the park board, which I did. And
is this here, this is Minneapolis Park Board?
Yeah,
or the,
yeah. And then somebody on the park board asked me if I would testify to the House Agriculture Committee on this, which I did. And it was sort of hilarious in a way because the legislators were puzzled because here was one member of the university saying that DDT is the wrong thing to use to deal with Dutch elm disease, and Larry Cutcomb from the Department of Entomology was saying it was the best possible thing to do. Here,
this was confusing because how could the university not have...
It was speaking with forked tongue. And of course the legislature had been used to having advisors come from the agriculture school to tell them about all these problems. And here was this upstart coming from a botany department to tell them it was all wrong. What was going on here? And it really puzzled them. And it led eventually, a few more illustrations of this sort, led the university to make a rule that when you went to testify, you could not speak on behalf of the university. You had to disclaim that anything that this was the university's view.
Oh, you can't put it as a common university view.
No.
Yeah. So you still represent the
I mean,
university.
it had been gospel for the the legislators to think what came from these people in agriculture was the university's view.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one result of this appearance before the legislature and the kerfuffle that developed from it over speaking for the university meant that forever after, when I went to speak to a group of any kind, public or private, I disclaimed speaking for the university. I said I was giving my own views only. So that constrained me a little. But it was really that event that made me realize that maybe I did have a responsibility to go out and talk to people outside the university. And so I started then to give talks to any group you care to name, church groups, school groups, lawyers groups, Conoco, the oil company.
Uh-huh.
And so I've given hundreds of talks on environmentalism. It took a few years, though, before I decided that I had to start teaching about it. Because
within the university?
Within the university. And so in around 1970, around for the first Earth Day, I started teaching a course called Biology and the Future of Man. It's politically incorrect title now. As I was reminded by one of my teaching assistants.
Biology, future of mankind.
Should have been the future of humanity.
Of humanity. Biology and the future of man, you call it, and that was okay then. But
well, it wasn't really okay because I proposed it, and I don't know whether I taught it alone the first time. I taught it for several years with Doug Pratt, but when I proposed it, it came before the Dean's Administrative Council of department heads, and I happened to be a department head of botany at the time, and this was dismissed as not the sort of course we ought to be teaching. We're teaching research scientists and doctors. This is soft science.
Sociology.
Yeah. So we don't really need a course like this. But I persisted, and because I was head of the department and so on, I got my way. I was allowed to teach it, but only on condition that I got no teaching credit for it. It wasn't part of my teaching load.
Oh.
I did it as an extra.
Oh, I see. You couldn't get. It didn't count. You had to
No,
do all
that's
your
right.
regular courses pluses. I see. So this was back in the 70s then.
That was about somewhere around 1970.
I see. And even at that point, in our science departments, this was not accepted. By the way, there's a point on this subject, biology and the future of man, the word man. In the 19th century, I looked this up in the Oxford Dictionary for a different purpose a while back, and in the 19th century, early 19th century, man meant person. And there was switching, the word person was just coming to the language. So this still lasted into the 20th century, that you could say man, meaning mankind, or meaning humanity.
Yeah.
But that has now become very politically sensitive, hasn't it? Anyway.
Politically incorrect.
Yeah.
But
so even then, though, this was, environmentalism was viewed as not
It was
legitimate.
not the legitimate topic for the College of Biological Sciences.
So that goes back 1970, it's going back 30 to 40 years.
Yeah, to just a few years after the college was founded,
Yeah.
66. But anyway, I decided to teach it. And I got Doug Pratt to collaborate. I'm not sure the first time, but eventually we wound up teaching it several times, both in day and evening school. And about 3 years after I started teaching it, CBS got a curriculum committee. So we put it before the curriculum committee, and they allowed us teaching credit.
Uh-huh.
But it was a no-no at first.
Mm-hmm. And you had good student interest at that time?
Oh, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Lots of students take the
So-
course.
yeah, so
and lots of people took it in evening school.
Right,
As a matter of fact,
1970s, it was all, the planet was shrinking, jet travel had become, if not ubiquitous, at least common.
Yeah.
Whereas when you first started doing your work on radioactivity and acid rain, the world was a huge place. Jet travel didn't much exist for ordinary people in the 60s,
That's right.
early in the 50s. So the world was starting, well, and in large part due to your work, people were realizing the Earth is a much smaller place.
well, and the person who really alerted the world was Rachel Carson. That book had a tremendous impact.
In 62 or thereabouts.
Yeah, 62.
Yeah.
But it then became legitimate to teach this course, and it was very popular. It actually led to a great surprise for me. One time I taught it in evening school. I taught it alone, and after I'd finished teaching the course, a letter arrived for me, and in it was a check for $3,000, and a letter from somebody in the course who said he'd reached the stage in life where he could reward people he thought deserved rewarding.
Huh. This is one of your students, an adult student.
An adult student.
In the evening course.
Yeah.
Sent you $3,000 in 1970s?
In a cashier's check. He didn't sign it.
Huh.
It was anonymous. He just wrote it as a student.
But $3,000 in the 70s, well, I think, what was the Dow Jones then, 1,000? So that's like 30,000 now.
It absolutely stunned me. In fact, I took it up to the bank and said, "Is this real?" And they said, "Well, there's our guy's signature on the check. Sure, it's real."
Uh-huh.
I tried to find out who it was. They wouldn't tell me who'd done this.
Huh.
So I still don't know, but I'm really grateful because Kirsten was just about to go to Radcliffe then.
Oh.
That $3,000 went right like that.
Huh. Wow.
But it was a stunning moment.
From the evening course.
Yeah.
And this eventually turned into a course from Future of Man to Our Changing Planet.
Well,
much later.
It got taught by. I get tired of teaching the same old course. So every 10 years or so, I devised something different. So I started talking about. Developed a course on environmental pollution, and with a lot of students from, say, the engineering school and so on. And Bill Cunningham continued teaching biology and the future of man under the topic of environmental science or something like that. Not nearly as catchy, but politically correct. And he taught it for years, and actually wrote a book on enviromentalism, on environmental science.
So you were working with Doug Pratt, and then Doug Pratt did some work back in that era, or a little bit later, on bioenergy and wetland cattails, and you were with him, or at least...
Well, I had done during my PhD, or no, I guess it was probably after my PhD, when I was teaching at London, I had done a survey with Professor Pearsall, who was a polymath. He had all sorts of interests. And one of them was peatlands and wetlands of various kinds. And in chatting together, we decided that it would be a good thing because there were no data on the productivity of natural wetlands.
How much, their yield.
At that time, there were no data.
On how much plant material they actually produced.
Yeah. And so we thought that the first step was to find out just how much biomass there was in these peatlands. And so we went out and we, with Cliff Dad, a graduate student, and my wife as a sort of note taker, so she could see something of the country. We traveled all over Scotland and England. And we started cutting down stands of various wetland plants.
Like cattails.
Cattails and
sedges
reeds and sedges and things of that sort. And what we found was that there was a big difference in the productivity of different wetland systems, the cattails being the most productive.
Cattails would produce the most biomass.
Yeah, around 10,000 kilograms per hectare or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but
10,000 kilograms per hectare. That's way above upland prairie. That's way above woodlands, I think.
I think that's about right, but I'm not sure now. It's so long ago.
So wetlands being very productive for producing plant material.
Some wetlands.
And what was this? Was this specifically for use for energy, or was this just to understand?
No, this was just to get some feeling for the productivity of wetlands.
From a scientific point of view?
People knew about forest productivity and cropland productivity.
Because there it's important for practical purposes.
But they knew nothing about the productivity of natural ecosystems at that time. And we decided that for wetlands, the first step was to find out just how much biomass they were producing each year. So we cut them down. We found that these cattails were very productive.
Which makes sense because they're not lacking water.
Yeah,
and they're not lacking nutrients.
Nutrients come in from the surrounding soils.
It makes sense that they should be highly productive.
Yeah. And so years later, when Doug Pratt and I were studying the the distribution of photosynthetic bacteria in wetlands, he was an expert on photosynthetic bacteria, a physiologist. I got him to get out in the country and get his feet wet. And in chatting about these things, we got talking about wetlands of various kinds, and I talked about the wetland productivity. There were now becoming a few measurements here and there, and suggested that he might like to look into this, that maybe we could do something together. So we had a student, Mike Penko, who was Doug's student. I was co-advisor, but he and Doug essentially did the work. I didn't have any part in the actual work.
But now this was actually targeted toward using wetlands for energy.
This was targeted at seeing whether they
could
using them as could the biomass be useful? Was this a useful source of biomass? And they found that the above ground part was only about half of what was there. That there was a lot of high carbohydrate rootstock underground. And their question arose, is there any way to utilize this? And so Doug and Mike did some further work on this. And then Doug became department head or something, and Mike went away. And
but all those published materials that from that era are now very useful today in this energy era.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, so for example, there's something like 10,000 square miles in Minnesota alone of drained wetlands that become poor corn, but could become good wildlife habitat at the same time as becoming bioenergy sources.
Useful biomass. You wouldn't touch the rootstocks because that's where the next crop comes from, but you just harvest the dead stalks in the fall.
Right. Yes, right. And so that's very relevant today.
And we were talking in those days about, how would you build a machine to do that and so on, but it never went anywhere.
But it's now going somewhere, it looks like. The places are all interested in this because it's a carbon neutral form of bioenergy, and also can enhance wildlife habitat, and also can purify water that isn't happening when they're drained. So,
and it also preserves some natural habitats. If you want to find a natural habitat in the Twin Cities, where do you go? The only places you can go are to the wetlands. They'll be altered, but they'll be the nearest thing to a natural environment that you'll find. So we should preserve them and have students taken to them. This is what real nature is like.
And agencies are now looking at this, and so all these papers that from that era are now becoming very relevant. Even though it was, I think, maybe 30, 40 years ahead of its time then. So that's how science has changed a lot since you first started.
Oh yeah.
And I think
in the old days when I started, you published alone. Very seldom you published with a colleague. It was very rare to have a paper with three authors. Maybe a fifth of the papers I published were with another author, quarter maybe at most. Now, during the last 10 years of my life, 3/4 of the papers had 3 or more authors. More and more collaborative research.
Was the research simpler then, or why was this?
Well, it was traditional to work alone, and for instance, John Macareth and I could have published a paper together, but we didn't. We he published separately on the lakes. I published separately on the acid rain.
You were working together, but you published separately.
Well, we weren't working together.
Oh, I see.
I was
didn't
working in
collaborate.
another lab. We didn't collaborate.
And
It just
nowadays-
happened that our results meshed, and we could have put them together into a paper.
And could have made a stronger paper, perhaps,
Yeah.
out of it. Uh-huh.
But he wasn't ready to publish, but very generously he allowed me to say that this lake survey was going on and that it was turning out that the tarns were being acidified by acid rain.
Mm-hmm.
It was very generous of him, but very characteristic.
Mm-hmm.
But in those days, that was the way science was done. It wasn't done in teams.
So what caused this change, do you think? That now, because now team science, big science, is the way we tend to do things. And
Yeah.
5, 6 authors on a paper isn't at all uncommon, even in
Yeah.
ecology.
That's right.
And so is this a change in society? Is it a change in the complexity of science?
Well,
Is it-
there are several reasons, I think. One is that the projects get bigger and larger in scope. You need more people. Another is that it's a way of training students. You can put more students through the system if you have big team research.
Mm-hmm.
My fear is that some of these multi-authored papers contain a lot of students who are merely technicians. They're just employed to be a technician. And in my day, you would have thanked them in the acknowledgments. Nowadays, they're co-authors.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't get the chance to develop their own project. They're part of a bigger project. And
I see. So big science has its advantages, but here's a disadvantage. Students don't.
That's right. They don't get the independence that I had.
Aha, which can be bad for science all around.
Yeah, yeah.
So in these projects, these big science projects, we must be careful to make separate directions for students that
Yeah.
that can be independent.
Yeah,
That's a
give
good
them a
lesson.
thesis project that they can do that is significant enough that it'll be worthwhile. And you know, it'll be part of the big project, but you've got to devise your big project so that you have enough thesis projects
Flexible.
that allow students to exhibit their originality. And one way to do that I've always followed is to tell my students, well, I'm here to suggest some topics. These are some things you might want to research. If you have an idea of your own, let's figure out how we can accomplish that. And I have had students who came in with their own ideas and they've been able to make theses of them. But I always made sure that my graduate students had a second string to their bow. Remembering my unfortunate master's experience, I made sure that they had something. If the main project they were on failed, they had something else they could push on, so they wouldn't get caught like I might have gotten caught.
Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing this now. What one tends to do, or what wants to do on these big projects today, is give graduate students some direction that'll match the project, but then that can kill all the kinds of things that were what you did in your career to take side paths. And so if we had someone like you and we gave them too close a direction to follow, none of all this would have happened.
Yeah, that's right. And somehow you've got to devise a way that
To make
they can exhibit their own originality.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate that I think some professors use graduate students as technicians. It's not the way to behave.
But this change to big science is it connected, do you think, with the now recognized importance of applications of science, or is it changes in society that have been happening? Or?
I think that's true. I think that people have come to realize there are more and more that we are now manipulating nature on nature's own scale.
Yeah.
That's new
Mm-hmm.
and dangerous. And I think people are realizing that we've got to get a handle on these environmental problems, and so they're more willing to fund them.
Yeah, and this is realized really across society today, in many, at least many parts of society.
But one of the problems that bugged me toward the end of my career was that in order to fund these big projects, you had to get big grants, and you had to write a lot of proposals to get one funded. Mm-hmm. And by the time my career was finished, I was writing as many proposals as I was scientific papers.
Yeah.
And that's not good. I mean,
And that remains the case today.
It remains the case today. I mean, why should someone like Margaret Davis, a Regents professor, a world authority, have to go hat in hand and write 4 proposals to get one funded. I mean, you know she's bright, give her some money and let her go.
Yeah.
If she turns out to be a dud, don't fund her next proposal.
Yeah.
But I think it's just must be terrible for young scientists beginning with the acceptance rate of proposals.
Yeah, which can be down
Would be
to
10
to 20%.
10 to 20%.
Yeah.
But that it's absolutely essential for them to get tenure, to get published. And to get published, they have to get grants. And with that sort of acceptance rate, it's very easy to become discouraged.
There's the advantage of a mathematical approach. You only need a grant to get you a pencil. And nowadays, a personal computer.
Yeah.
So I wonder what this is. Is it a change in the application of science? Is it a change in society that's causing this? I think it's just a change in the complexity of science and the,
Yeah, that's right.
the
Yeah,
interconnectedness.
that's right.
So now that we're realizing things are so strongly interconnected,
Yeah.
we have to make up teams that have many
different members from different disciplines. I mean,
From different
you're a
disciplines.
mathematical modeler. You would never have worked with me 50 years
ago, right? And now we see the interconnection.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what people don't realize is that physics and chemistry are the easy sciences. Biology is more difficult.
Right.
Ecology is more difficult still.
Correct.
The social sciences are most difficult of all.
Yeah, just about impossible.
Just about impossible. Look at the economic fix we're in.
Right.
Economics is not a science, really. They pretend it is because they have these fancy models, but it's not a science.
Yeah.
And I think we may be reaching a point where the pace of change from technology based on the basic sciences of physics and chemistry is advancing faster than the capacity of social science to accommodate the consequences. We're putting more and more of the world's environment at risk without knowing what we're doing. We're a bunch of sorcerers' apprentices. And it may be that this difference in the pace of change of basic technology and social science development is going to do us in the end. That's a possibility.
Yeah, the dangers of technological changes, they seem to take something like 15 years for a major technological change to start to go to completion. But social changes seem to take something like 15 generations.
That's right.
And so, on the other hand, nations can turn on a dime and do something when they know. Like example with your example with nuclear fallout, and even with acid rain. That wasn't quite on a dime.
And the fluorocarbons was even quicker.
Right, yeah. There's a lot of these examples. For example, the Cuyahoga River hasn't caught fire for 40 years.
Yeah.
These are, so we can turn on a dime, but major social changes are very slow.
Well, take political will. Politicians live on a very short time frame, the next election. So they can't take the long view if they want to stay in the
They have to at least have a very strong part be the short view.
That's right. And look at the current situation we're in. Not a single Republican voted for the stimulus bill in the House. Not a single one. Now, imagine trying to fix climate change. This is trying to fix the economy, which everybody recognizes is in crisis and that our lives depend on it. But most people don't realize that the lives of their grandchildren depend on climate change, that we're leaving them a terrible legacy. And so the politicians put it way down on the list. And I think to get climate change legislation through the present legislature, even with Obama enthusiastic and charismatic as he is, will be very, very difficult.
It will be very interesting to watch now.
It will be.
Around the time of Thanksgiving this year, I was interested in seeing that whereas the European nations were saying, now that we have this world economic crisis, we can't worry about the environment. But in this country, the then about to be new administration was saying, this is precisely the time to use environment
right.
as a stimulus package. So this next year is really crucial.
Yeah.
Next few years are really crucial.
Yeah, it's an illustration of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, that it takes a major shock to change course.
Yeah. So then this is...
and I'll give you another example from acid rain. When we had the Great London Smog of 1952. Ada and I lived through it. 4,000 people died in a week because of it. And because of that, the Brits decided, well, it happened, they had some minor episodes in the next few years that convinced them that they had to do something. What they did was stop people using soft coal in their fireplaces, and they built much taller smokestacks on their power plants, sent the pollution drifting off to Scandinavia. The Germans did the same thing. The Germans and the Brits didn't give a damn what they were doing to Scandinavia. And
Or did they maybe not know?
they didn't know, but they were, when they were alerted by Svante Odin in about 1972 in the first United Nations Conference on the Environment, they couldn't care less. But in Germany, when the Black Forest began to be affected by acid rain, this was deep in the German psyche, and so they decided they'd do something about it. Mm-hmm. When we were concerned about the Boundary Waters Canoe area, they were going to set up a plant at Atikokan power plant in Canada, and they were going to use soft coal that would be high sulfur. And we just fought the battle to save the BWCA when here's the threat of acid rain coming from Atikokan. So we had an immediate mobilization of people because the BWCA is deep in the Minnesota psyche. So it takes a psychic shock to get action going.
So I wonder if the difference now and the hope now would be this. People, of course, always protect what they love and what's dear to them, and that's their local area. Now the world is even much smaller than it was when you started working on these things with acid rain and nuclear fallout. And so now what we do is a global phenomenon. So now are people coming to realization that the things we do locally and that other people do globally affect everybody, and can that make a global consciousness on this?
I really don't know. I used to tell my students that catastrophe's on our side. That it takes the psychic shock to get people worked up enough to do something about a problem, an environmental problem. Catastrophe's on our side. It takes that to mobilize public opinion. But I have been driving for the last 6 years down to a nursing home to visit my wife, who recently died of Alzheimer's disease. Each day I would take Highway 94. I would drive at 50 miles per hour, 5 miles below the speed limit. Do you think anybody ever stayed behind me? Everybody passed me, going like hell, going way over the speed limit. And that tells me that the message hasn't gone home. We've got to stop using so much energy. And in the course of it, we would save money, we would save our dependence on foreign oil, and we would save lives. I actually wrote a letter to the Strib pointing this out, that what should happen if we want to save energy and money and lives is that the police should enforce the speed laws. They wouldn't publish it. So I think people just don't realize.
It's also maybe, is this part of it, part of the nature of democracy? In a democracy, people don't put restrictions on themselves directly, but they do put restrictions on other things. So like the acid rain cleanup. What people voted to do is make power companies produce cleaner energy.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't increase their cost directly. It increases the electrical company's cost, at least at first.
And they'll
but then
pass it on.
eventually increases the cost as a secondary effect. So in a democracy as we have and as the world is been moving to for the whole 20th century, what kind of things then do we have to do to get environmental things happen? It has to be legislative. I think the acid rain might be part of an idea, part of the idea of how you make these things work, how you make environmental policies work.
It has to be legislative, and as I say, the legislators' focus is very short term, the next election. So how do they ever take the long view and make an unpopular decision to raise the gas tax, to put on a carbon tax, to put a cap on carbon?
Yeah, so legislators can't do that. They only reflect what people want them to do in the future. So that means then that the final education has to be with the people.
Yeah.
And ultimately then, I suppose, with the young people.
And you know, we're not only mortgaging the financial future of our young people with our economic catastrophes, we're mortgaging their whole lifestyle by destroying the environment. And the world certainly can't sustain a population of 9 billion at an American style of living. We know that the Chinese style of living is improving. It's improving in India. There has to be a drop in our standard of living. I think inevitably we shall have less of the world's resources than we've been used to. And that the geopolitical consequences of that will be resource wars, water wars, and catastrophes of various kinds. If we don't come to our senses and realize that we're all in this together, we're in deep trouble. I fear for my grandchildren.
Do you see this? Do you see us coming to that point?
No, I don't.
You don't see a change in.
I don't think it will come fast enough because, as I say, the pace of technology
is changing.
Is much faster than the pace of social change.
Yet in these other examples, like acid rain, nuclear fallout, we did make the change.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and there's another point to make. The fact is that all these material accumulations that we get that are depleting the world's resources aren't making us any happier. You know, when we lived in the Lake District, Ada and I, we lived in a small stone laborer's cottage adjacent to a farmhouse owned by the deputy director of the Institute. We had a little radio that got the Welsh Home Service. And we had a stove. We had no refrigerator. We had no washer, no dryer, no television, none of those things. And we were happy as could be. We did not become happier as we accumulated material possessions. And I sometimes put my view this way, that there's been an exponential rise in population. There's been an exponential rise in knowledge. There's been an exponential rise in technology coming from that knowledge. But there has not been an exponential rise in wisdom or loving kindness in human beings. And that's, if those things get too far out of phase, we're in deep trouble.